Jarrett chapter 12, World War II study cards. We're going to be looking at World War II, the study cards you can find at the back of each Jarrett chapter. And so I thought we would take a few moments, not a lot of time, take a few moments to look over each and every one of these cards. Let us begin. Our first card is entitled The Return to a Policy of Isolationism. Now, we have discussed this numerous times. This goes all the way back to George Washington. And through Washington, through the late 1700s, early 1800s, through the end of the 1800s, up into World War I, we tried to remain out of European affairs as much as possible. We were dragged into World War I, we were dragged into World War II, but this concept, this belief that we should remain isolated is something that we have as a nation favored for a long time. Let's take a quick look at it. The United States refused to become a member of the League of Nations even though we are the ones who proposed it. It was President Woodrow Wilson who proposed the League of Nations, one of his 14 points, and we never joined it. Why? Because again, we wish to remain isolated from the events in Europe. Other things we did, we placed high tariffs on European goods. Not a great idea. It hurt us economically and helped lead to the Great Depression. Why do we do it? To remain out of European affairs. We placed quotas on European and Asian immigrants. Why? Because we did not want them bringing their problems to our shores. Finally, we insisted on collecting war debts from both France and Britain, money they owed us, money we had loaned them at the start of World War I. This, of course, created all kinds of economic woes for those nations because, again, they owed us money and they had trouble paying it off. Basically, we're telling them, hey, we want you to pay us off and we want you to leave us alone. Our second one, expectations. Hold on. Lucky you, I'm back. Exceptions to the policy of isolationism, though. Here are some examples of things that we did do that took us out of our isolationist mode. Number one, the neutrality acts, that A should be capitalized, I apologize. We had several acts passed between 1935 and 1937. The cash and carry policy. These, of course, are terms that we have had in our vocabulary terms. You can go back and refer to them if you don't remember them. FDR's quarantine speech in 1937. The Flying Tigers. Volunteer American flyers who supplied China with war materials and, more importantly, flew for the Chinese against the Japanese. Lend-Lease in 1941, and then the Atlantic Charter in 1941, and what came from that, most importantly, was FDR's Four Freedoms. Now, what do all of these have in common? Well, again, they're all, among other things, they're all part of our vocabulary terms, so we've covered them already. But there are all ways in which we try to get around being neutral, being isolationist, in order to help our friends. Cash and carry, for example, the Flying Tigers, Lend-Lease, and the Atlantic Charter are all things that benefited the Allies, and of course those are the people that we will join and fight against the Axis powers. Our next slide. The origins of World War II, and this, of course, is really pretty simple. We've talked about it previously, of course. The origins of World War I, to put it most simply, World War II started when World War I ended. It was the Treaty of Versailles. It was the reparations Germany had to pay to the English and the French. It was the War of Guilt Clause. Those things led to World War II. But let's look at this. The rise of fascism in Europe. In Italy, we had Benito Mussolini, who seized power shortly after World War I ended. He glorified action, obedience to leader, and to violence. In Germany, you have Adolf Hitler, who came to power due to a shaky democracy that was put in place by the Allies at the end of World War I. The Weimar Republic, no one in Germany liked it. It was corrupt, it was ineffective, and so Hitler was able to come to power thanks to their incompetence, and of course, you had a huge rise in unemployment. Fascist leaders sought expansion through the use of force. Failure of appeasement. Appeasement, giving in to a bully. At the Munich conference, Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of England, attempted to satisfy his thirst. He attempted to quench Hitler's thirst by giving in to Hitler's demand for territories that used to belong to Germany, the Sudetenland, for example. The idea was that if the European democracies gave in to Hitler, they could avoid war. Little good it did them, because what happened next, shortly after the Munich conference is over, shortly after Neville Chamberlain goes home and tells the world, I have met with Herr Hitler and we have achieved peace in our time, Germany invades Poland in 1939, which officially starts World War II. Now, there had been other provocative events that had taken place prior. For example, you have the Japanese invading Manchuria in 1931, China in 1937, and then Indochina in 1941. And we took a look at this at the map when we were looking at some of the key battles in World War II. The Italians, though it's not mentioned on this one, because we often overlook the Italians' contributions to World War II because they didn't really do a whole lot. But anyway, they had invaded Ethiopia a few years earlier, prior to 1939, and so again, all three countries were aggressors. Let's move on to our next slide. The U.S. enters the war. Now, you got to keep in mind, much like World War I, America could not stay out of World War II for very long. It was just impossible to do so because the world economy was so interconnected because of our close ties to the Allies, particularly the English and the French. We just couldn't stay out. Now, of course, it also helped when the Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941. When the Japanese destroyed 18 American ships and killed upwards of 3,000 Americans on that day, yeah, we're not going to take that lying down. So we entered the war against Japan. The next day, Germany and Italy declared war on us. Why? Because Germany and Italy were allies with Japan, and they were all part of the Axis powers. We declared war on one, the other two declared war on us. On the home front, this is something that we saw similar, or something we will see that was similar to World War I. We had rationing and the sale of war bonds. Those are not the same things. Rationing was the conservation of goods, whether it be oil, gasoline, nylon, food, doesn't really matter. And so people were allowed to buy a certain amount per week or per month. It depends on the item and other variables. War bonds, of course, were sold in order to raise money in order to pay off the war. Victory gardens aided in the growing of food. You may have a small plot of land in your backyard that you plow up and maybe plant. Hold on. Okay, I was interrupted for a moment by a student. Anyway, so we're back to victory gardens. You may plow up a little bit of your backyard and plant tomatoes or corn, watermelons, whatever it may be. If you lived in a city, you may put a little bit of a flower box on your windowsill and then maybe raise I guess a tomato plant or something small like that. Again, the idea was you were sort of supplementing the food supply. That way we could save food to send over to our allies and our troops overseas. We have the propaganda war. This is the role of the WWII. Okay, talked about this. We talked about the posters and the motion pictures and the audio and the video going out to spur on Americans to join the war effort and to raise consciousness against the Axis powers. Women are now taking a larger role in the workforce, just as they done in World War I. Okay, Rosie the Riveter is born. We've seen the image of her. There's an image of her in, I believe, both books. And so women's role in the workforce grew. In addition to the workforce, women also played a much larger role in the military than they have ever done before. Minorities, Hispanics, African Americans are now seeing more opportunities come their way, but they're also seeing some more obstacles. We are still living in a segregated America. African Americans are desegregated in the Navy. Blacks serve on ships along with whites. Now, of course, blacks are not taught or not trained to combat roles. Their main role in the Navy was on ships as cooks, in the laundry, those types of things. But again, we are seeing whites and blacks mingle, desegregate the Navy. The rest of the military was segregated. But we are seeing opportunities grow for them, and thanks to people like Vernon Baker, they are gaining more and more recognition for their contributions, their deeds during the war. Let's move forward. The internment of Japanese Americans, people of Japanese descent along the West Coast, were rounded up by Executive Order 9066, issued by FDR, and they were moved inland to camps, and there is a map in the Jarrett book we've taken a look at, where they were housed until the war was over. Years later, decades later, reparations were paid to the survivors of those families or to the descendants to illustrate how wrong this was. Now, even though the Supreme Court ruled in the Korematsu versus United States case that this was constitutional, it's not. Again, the Constitution is not a suicide pact. There are some things we can do. There's some leeway, but the rounding up of all Japanese as a result of Executive Order 9066, that's just not right. It was a mistake. Unfortunately, that mistake has not been repeated since. Let us continue with our next slide. And the next slide is fighting in World War II. There are two fronts. There are two different battles taking place in World War II. First off, we have the fighting in, oops, sorry, that was the wrong one, forgive me. First, we have the fighting in World War II. We have the war in Europe, and then we have the war in the Pacific. So we have two fronts. We have the European front, and we have the Pacific front. In Europe, we have the Holocaust, the killing of Jews and others to the tune of 11 to 12 million dead men, women, and children, all at the hands of the Nazis. D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Allies invade Normandy, France. This begins the removal of the Germans from France, forcing them back into Germany, where they are then defeated and Hitler is killed. Western Allies and the Soviets invade Germany. This takes place after D-Day. Once the Allies are able to get a beachhead on the Normandy beach, they're able to move into France, capture, kill all the Germans in their way, force the Germans to retreat back to Germany. The Soviets were advancing from the east through countries that are now Yugoslavia and what was Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia and Romania and Poland into Germany, and we met in Germany at Berlin. By the way, the Soviets were there first. Okay, let's go back to the War of the Pacific now. The Bataan Death March in 1942. Upwards of 5,000 Allied troops were captured, forced to march about 60 miles, where about half of them died. Navajo code talkers. Navajo language is almost impossible to learn unless you are raised with it from an early age. The Japanese were never, ever able to break it. We, the United States, defeat the Japanese in a naval battle at the Battle of Midway. This was in 1940. This should be 42. I don't know why I typed 43. I apologize. That is a mistake. It should be 1942. Oops. Sorry about that. I need to correct that. This is a major turning point in the war. Where? In the war in the Pacific. Okay, again, I hate my arrow. That's just getting worse and worse. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's not a whole lot better. We'll leave it at that, though. Okay. Atomic bombs. 2 of them are dropped on Japan. 2 of them are dropped. They are dropped on the cities of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Hiroshima first on August the 6th, 1945. Nagasaki 3 days later, August the 9th. Japan surrenders, and the war comes officially to an end. Let's go to our next slide. We should have 2 more slides. We're going to look at some of the key individuals in World War II. Okay, key individuals in World War II. Let us start with Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, elected to 4 terms. He served as president during the bulk of World War II. He did die shortly after being inaugurated for his 4th term, a few months prior to the end of the war. But again, he was president for the bulk of the war. He worked quite closely with the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who took over after the Munich conference fiasco, the appeasement of Hitler. Okay. Harry Truman becomes president upon the death of FDR. Truman is FDR's VP. He becomes president. Shortly after FDR dies, he is sworn in. He makes a decision to use atomic bombs on Japan, which of course then ends the war with the Japanese. Vernon Baker, African-American, who later received the Congressional Medal of Honor, which is the highest award our nation has to offer. He was awarded this in 1945. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Dwight David Eisenhower, often referred to as Ike. Eisenhower, often referred to as Ike. Supreme Commander of the D-Day invasion of Europe at Normandy. He was the Supreme Commander of all Allied forces in Europe. Let's move on to our last slide, which of course is the continuation of the key individuals in World War II. And we'll start off with the General George Marshall. He was the Chief of Staff, that S probably should be capitalized, under FDR, and he helped form and equip the U.S. Army. He was instrumental in getting our Army up and running. Next, we have General Omar Bradley. He commanded the army that landed at Normandy. He was the American commander of the Normandy invasion. Now, again, Eisenhower is the supreme commander. He is the one who planned the bulk of the invasion, but the person who actually carried out the invasion, the person who was actually in control of the invasion, in command of the invasion, was Omar Bradley. Admiral Chester Nimitz, he was the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and he was the man in charge of the U.S. forces at the Battle of the Midway. So not only was he the commander of all the U.S. Pacific Fleet, he was the guy who was in command of the Battle of Midway. Midway, of course, was a turning point in the war in the Pacific. The Japanese would have gained control of Midway Island and were able to put troops and long-range bombers and a naval force at Midway. The war probably would have ended differently in the Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur. He was the commander of the U.S. Army, which was fighting in the Pacific. He was the guy pretty much in charge of the island-hopping campaign. And once the war is over, he is the one who was put in charge when we occupy Japan. When American forces occupied Japan, Douglas MacArthur was the man in charge of that. Finally, we go to General George Patton. He was commander of U.S. 3rd Army, and he was our best tank commander, arguably the best tank commander in the war. Tanks played a much larger role in World War II than they did in World War I. He was the Army commander. He was the tank commander as we invaded first Africa, and then the island of Sicily, and then the country of Italy. All right, we are done with that. We have finished our look at the the study cards. That's what it is, the study cards of Chapter 12. Let me, wait. We're waiting for the machine. It's kind of slow. There we go. Let's use this color. We're looking at Chapter 12, World War II. That's only one, I'm sorry. World War II study cards. We be done. 20 minutes, yay. and bye.